Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Linda Karadaku, a journalist from ABC News Albania, and I'm going to be your host today with a distinguished panel. We are going to discuss two very important issues. One of them is how to keep the Western Balkans Western, and the other one is how to deter and how to counterfight, if I can say so, the Russian and Chinese influence in the Western Balkans. But let me first introduce the distinguished panel. We have here Mr. Ivo Daalder. He's a CEO, Chicago Council on Global Affairs from the United States. Thank you very much. Angelos Syrigos, member of the Greek Parliament, Hellenic Republic. Thank you very much. Marilena, Koppa, professor of comparative politics, Panteion University, Greece. Thank you for being here. And we have Valbona Zeneli, non-resident senior fellow, Europe Center, Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security from the Atlantic Council. Let's start immediately. I would like to make a very, very short presentation of what it is about that we are going to discuss today. As we said, the first question would be how to keep the Western Balkans Western. And actually, the basic point now would be to discuss if we have a shift on what we used to call and what we used to see as a transatlantic Western set of values. Has anything shifted? Has anything changed? And for the second topic, the Russian and Chinese influence, we all know that the Balkans, especially the Western Balkans, has always been a stage and a theater for, Putin's interest and Moscow interest in the region. They have always been very important for them. We have seen them play down in the narrative, in the rhetoric. We have seen misinformation, and we have seen Russia involved in almost every process that has been going on around. And for the Chinese influence, we have been used to see it as mainly political, but we all know that together they come like in a combined package with political influence, such as sort of importing or showing a model of authoritarianism, which means economy and politics, as always, they go together, and with China, they come together with a political model. But let's have the guests discuss that. So I would like very much to start with the first one, and it's for you, Mr. Daalder. How can we define nowadays the transatlantic Western values that we want the Western Balkans to embrace and to be as such? Do we have any shift, having in mind the geopolitical situation which has shifted already?
Well, Western values, if the same yesterday as they are today and they will be tomorrow, the values are the same. And they're not just transatlantic. There are many countries around the world, including in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, throughout Africa, into Asia, that embrace a universal conception of individual rights, of the rule of law, of the importance of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, of elections as a way to determine who governs you. I would argue these aren't just Western, they are true liberal values. And there are, at times, challenges to those values, even within the countries that have long championed them. And we've seen this in Europe, including in the Western Balkans, where there are countries who espouse and even talk about the importance of Western values, but then violate them in their behavior. And that is true even for long-established democracies. We are having a particular challenge in the United States today, which was inescapable to have discussed in the 3 days here in this conference. We'll see if we can have an entire discussion without mentioning a particular person's name, which may be not possible, but we'll find out whether that's possible.
Sorry to interrupt, but let's stick to that. So are they being challenged? This transatlantic set of Western values, is it being challenged?
So I think the transatlantic relationship is being challenged.
And the values?
Well, the values are being challenged, but they have traditionally been challenged. I mean, we have, Portugal was a member of NATO, even though it was a dictatorship until the early 1970s. Greece, during the time of the colonels, was a member of NATO, and she clearly was challenging Western values at that time. So this is a long history. I think what's new is that we are living in an era in which the major guarantor of transatlantic and European security has a different view of the threat. It embraces Russia, and in fact voted with Russia at the UN on the critical issue of Ukraine, and has a different conception of security. Whereas really since December 7, 1941, when the United States entered World War II, the security of Europe has been seen as fundamental to the security of the United States. That's no longer true, at least not for this administration. So that's the challenge, but it's not a challenge of values, it's a challenge of policy.
Got it. And Mr. Syrigos, how Western is the Western Balkans nowadays? How do you see it?
Okay, we have to see the difference between the various countries in the Western Balkans. It is not the same situation with Chinese and Russian influence in Serbia and in Albania. Let me give a first example. I believe that Serbia is the main theater where both Russia and China are active, and most of all, they are welcomed. Russia is not welcomed in Albania. Albania has other problems with Western values, but Albania does not welcome Russia, for example. And moreover, we have to see which are the key differences between China and Russia. China is economy first. That means it's all about trade, infrastructure, technology, and they are trying to buy loyalty through prosperity, often avoiding to speak about sensitive political topics. Whereas with Russia, the situation is totally different. They speak about identity. They speak about religion, the Orthodox religion, language, history, and security ties. And quite often they use disruptive or polarizing tactics. So Serbia, I believe, is the main theater of influence as it concerns China and
Russia. Yeah?
And Russia. Northern Macedonia, they received a loan from Hungary last year, which is very interesting because Hungary is a poor country. And the question is, who paid the money for the loan? That's a good question. Last but not least, Albania is an interesting case. I believe that Albania is moving towards an autocratic style of governance. 6 months ago, the two leaders of the opposition were either in jail or in-house arrest. So we're going to have elections on the 11th of May, if I remember well. In the case of Albania, the problem is not China and Russia, it is what you called earlier transatlantic values.
I understand. Ms. Zeneli, is having a justice system totally independent from politics and well-functioning in the region, which does not allow impunity for anyone in the system, is it, and should it remain, one of the preconditions for any of the Balkan countries to become part of the European Union, which is a tool, enlargement, as a tool to keep the countries of the Western Balkans Western?
Of course. I mean, we know that these are all homework, and it's the main drivers for reforms for the countries to both join NATO, and Albania is a NATO country, like other countries in the Western Balkans, but also the European Union. And as you mentioned, it's a parallel process. The EU enlargement process in the succession has been meant from the European Union to also support state building, institutional building of the countries in the Western Balkans. But let me get back to the conversation on Western values. Is the Western Balkans Western? I believe so, because it's a priority of all governments in the Western Balkans to follow Euro-Atlantic integration. In some countries, NATO is not a priority, but most of the other countries, NATO is also. So I believe the Western Balkans are West-leaning countries. But it's much, I think it's a broader conversation that Ivo started, that when we talk about Western values, what is Western values?
Exactly.
It's rule of law, it's human rights, it's justice, you know, a fair justice system. So those are the fundamental human rights that we call those Western norms and Western
are we on
standards.
the right way with that? Are we on the right way with that? On those key elements?
Of course, I mean, there are challenges, but it's not only challenges for the Western Balkans. I think, you know, great power competition today globally is centering more also on forms of governance, and that's why we have to pay even more attention to those norms and standards. It's a dichotomy between democracies and autocracies all around the world, and that's why I believe, be that in the Western Balkans, but also other areas of Europe and globe, I think resilience is key for the future. Democratic resilience should be the center of all those reforms.
Yeah. And Ms. Koppa, let's keep going a little bit on this one, because it seems pretty fundamental for our Western values and moving the region towards the European Union. With the starting of the Russian invasion against Ukraine, we saw that the European Union was kind of going back again to the idea of enlargement, mainly for geopolitical reasons. We know that many of the Balkan countries could need a lot to fulfill the economic standards, or others, based on the chapters. But still, for the sake of geopolitical reasons, we see enlargement back again, democratic reforms. We have a push from Brussels to do more and more to get online, like put our ducks on a row when it comes to the European Union. Is this should it remain kind of a deterrent to Russian and Chinese influence in the region? And should the EU get faster, and we get faster in the region with that?
The immediate answer is yes, but let me take it from the start.
Yeah.
First of all, we all know that the Western Balkans have again become a geopolitical chessboard where rival powers fight for influence. Either traditional powers that have always been there, like Russia or Turkey, or new entries such as China or the Gulf states. The problem is, the main problem for the region was the inconsistent EU policy. Since Croatia was the last country to enter the Union in 2013, the whole enlargement process seems to be freezed. So it's again after the Russian invasion in the region in 2022 that there was a renewed interest in enlargement. But what we see now is that only the Western Balkans accession must be absolutely in relation with the Eastern Trio, or duo, if you want, Ukraine and Moldova. And why? It's because the enlargement as a policy has become a totally bureaucratic process and was not on the EU agenda for the last many, many years. And this did not help, because we usually speak about enlargement fatigue, but the countries in the region was also faced with reform fatigue, because you cannot continuously change the goalpost in the middle of a game. So that was the EU consistency, I think, was at the core of the problem, because it gave the space to China, to Russia, to build their influence in the region. This was problem number one. Problem number two was a very interesting notion by a Montenegrin academic, which is stabilitocracy. The EU favored stability over democracy in the Balkans since 2014 at least. It supported governments such as the government of Nikola Gruevski in North Macedonia, or Vucic in Serbia, or even Edi Rama in Albania. It means, in order to have stability in the region, we don't really care about rule of law, democracy, and human rights. And the main problem is that they still continue to do so. For example, the way they face the huge, massive, impressive demonstration in Serbia of the student movement, and continuing to supporting the regime of Aleksandar Vucic, me as a European is a total disgrace. I mean, if you talk about human rights, rule of law, you must implement it. You cannot have double standards. You cannot follow a policy, an ad hoc policy. So if you talk about democracy, first of all, and it's normal, you must fight for democracy in your own house, namely in the case of Hungary, which we know it happens, and I don't want to elaborate on that, but even in the associate member states. So you cannot, criticize problems of rule of law in other countries, and in some countries, not speak at all. Yeah. So we must choose, we must be honest, we must be direct.
Yeah. And Mr. Daalder, I would like to go back to you with, actually, it's one basic question about the Balkans in general, but Western Balkans, it's specific about that. We have seen so many wars in the last decades, and since I remember, I'm almost 55 now, and I always remember that there was a war somewhere in the Balkans. It's a theater in which Russia in particular has always had its own interests and used them in all kinds of ways. Now we have kind of two hotspots. We have a Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. It's kind of a dead end for now. We don't know how the European Union would be able to shift it around and try to kind of, put it back on stage. And we also have Bosnia and Herzegovina. We have Republika Srpska. Mr. Dodik has run away to Russia, but still Republika Srpska remains such a place which is not like really integrated into the federal state of Bosnia and Herzegovina and remains a hotspot in which we don't know what we can see. The question is, what can be done now in the Western Balkans to keep those hotspots under control and not allow Russia to turn it into kind of a second front or a new stage of conflict, like open conflict?
The disintegration of Yugoslavia is still ongoing. It's never actually been resolved, even though 2 wars have been fought. Foreign intervention has been part of that, NATO in both cases, in Bosnia and in the case of Kosovo and Serbia. But the underlying issues that led to the disintegration of Yugoslavia are still there. And those are the ones that need to be resolved. And the only ones that can actually resolve them are the parties themselves. And unless and until they are willing to do so, you're going to have conflict. And the only way to prevent that conflict is to either suppress it, which is basically what we've been doing in Kosovo since the war, by having a large NATO and EU presence, which suppresses and somehow finds ways to say, if you're going to have differences, let's express those politically and perhaps economically, but not militarily, or through the use of force. And in the case of Bosnia, an international presence has tried to do the same thing. But we haven't spent a lot of time, neither the EU nor, frankly, the United States or others, to try to resolve the underlying problems, because we told ourselves we solved those in 1995 in the case of Bosnia through the Dayton Accords, and in 1999 through the end of the war, but in fact we haven't resolved it. Now, that's one part of the complicated question. The larger part of the complicated question is there's conflict, there's opportunity. And there's an opportunity both to try to figure out a way to have the states in this region transform themselves to such an extent that they become integrated in Western institutions, primarily in the European Union, but ultimately perhaps in NATO as well. But secondly, it becomes an opportunity for those who want to exploit division to enhance their power. And that's clearly what Russia has been doing, frankly, since 1995, when they were invited into Bosnia by the United States and NATO, and they've been doing it ever since. And China, I agree, to a certain extent, is playing the economic game, but it's doing so for political reasons. We are in a great power competition. And that is a world that is very different than the world when Yugoslavia disintegrated, when the Cold War had ended, when China was focused on rebuilding its own economy, when Russia was trying to figure out what its future was. They have now figured it out. And they're competing very actively with not only democracies, but frankly with the United States and the European Union as political powers. And so the question of where you balance, on the one hand, the power competition you have, versus on the other hand, the importance of maintaining Western values and the rule of law, is playing out in the streets in Serbia. It is playing out throughout the entire region.
How does it come out? What?
It is playing out. It's playing out because you have different interests. When it comes to playing a great power game, than you have if you're trying to play a Western values game. Those interests clash. If they always were the same, life would be so much easier for all of us. But they're not. And so the question of keeping Serbia out of the Russian and Chinese sphere is perhaps as important, or to some extent more important, than whether you support particular people on the street. That's the balancing act. That's from a policy perspective. We all have our individual views of what we would like, and we would prefer to be able to support democracy as a means to counter that influence. But that's not always the case. And I think that's part of why we're having this dilemma in the policymaking sphere.
Yeah. Ms. Zeneli, let's talk a little bit about what's happening in the security and defense front. We have NATO in the Western Balkans. Basically, it's only Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina which are out of it. And even
Kosovo
those
too.
two countries, yeah, but we have NATO in Kosovo. That's why I did not include it in the puzzle. Basically, even for those two countries, they are surrounded by NATO countries, NATO members. The question still remains, is that heavy NATO presence in the region, including in Kosovo, enough to deter any future conflicts? Or we still should be concerned that something might just break out?
Well, of course, the Western Balkans is an area that still has, pockets of instability despite the progress that we have seen over the last 30 years. But I'd like to link it with the EU integration process of the region and NATO integration, because we should not forget that the EU is a peace project. And the EU enlargement is the best tool that the EU has had for the security of Europe. It was a reminder, the Russian invasion, the second invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago, that traditional war came back, returned to Europe after the conflicts in the 90s in a much bigger scale this time. And I think that's what pushed the renewal of enlargement, seeing it from the security perspective too, because I think that was missing in the last 10 to 20 years. It had become a technical, technocratic...
But it's also a security issue.
Of course, enlargement
basically.
is security. Enlargement is about security of Europe, about a Europe at peace, free and prosperous. And we cannot achieve that
But
without
also
the
for the
Western
Western
Balkans.
Balkans.
Western Balkans is part of Europe. It's a natural part of Europe. Historically, culturally, it's becoming economically. So it's important that, but also in every single round of enlargement, the 5 rounds of enlargement, it has been always about geopolitics and security. And we had forgot that in the last 13 years of non-enlargement. So I believe that from that perspective, the Western Balkans can bring a lot to the table of transatlantic security. You have 3 NATO member countries, and we should not forget also one of the important exercises that took place in the region back in 2021, Defender 21. That was the main country was Albania, but the exercise was happening throughout the region, and that's key for the security of Europe with what's happening in the Black Sea with Ukraine. So we should not forget the security dimension of the Western Balkans and how can become part of European solutions and transatlantic solutions.
Got it. Mr. Syrigos, I would like to ask you something about China's influence in the region, but as a combination of politics and the economy. We talk about China coming in economically, and it has been happening actually for at least 2 decades now that we see them coming. But on the other hand, the European Union remains the main trade partner for the countries in the region. Having the European Union more and more engaged in the region, including the enlargement process that we have been talking about, would that help the EU to hold the cards for the region and not allow China's economic power to turn more and more into a political influence and, let's put it the right way, a political power in the region?
First, there is an issue of geography. Western Balkans are part of the European continent, and this is a fact. That gives a clear advantage to the European Union. Nevertheless, China is trying to play a role via the Belt and Road Initiative. Let me take the example of Serbia. I took note of the works that China undertakes in Serbia. They have projects like the Belgrade-Budapest Railway, they fund it, the Sino-Serbian Friendship Bridge, and they also build some highways and industrial zones. In the case of Montenegro, China gave them $1 billion as a loan for a controversial highway project, Bogliare. And now it is deeply in debt. That has to do with the so-called debt diplomacy. We give a debt to a country, we give a loan to a country, and then we expect that the project will not work and we shall take the project under our control.
Sorry to interrupt. It's a loan trap. It's like a trap,
yes,
in which
it's
these countries fall in.
It's a debt trap.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
This is the so-called debt trap diplomacy.
Yes, exactly.
They have used it in the case of Pakistan and Bangladesh, the Chinese. Moreover, we have some state-owned enterprises which are bought by Chinese companies. The steel company of Serbia has been bought by the HBIS group. They also entered in the mine industry, the energy and telecom. Huawei has a very strong footprint, both in Serbia and Montenegro. And we have the digital and tech influence through the Digital Silk Road. This is the other initiative. And we can see that Huawei is building a lot of surveillance systems all over the area. And this raises concerns, especially in the European Union, because, European Union is very skeptical on the way that Huawei enters in the European continent. And finally, we have soft power. Soft power comes through the various Confucius institutes in the universities. They have both in Serbia and Bosnia. They have media cooperation with very large Chinese TV channels, and they also use elite-level diplomacy to bypass the European Union. They offer high-level attention. They offer photo opportunities for smaller Balkan states. All these are important for these small states to show that a strong state like China plays with them. And finally, we have the support of China to Serbia as it concerns Kosovo. Why? Because Serbia supports China as it concerns its policy on the one China policy. So they have diplomatic support in international forums. Understood.
And Ms. Koppa, let's stay a little bit to China. And I would like to ask Ms. Zeneli later the same question, basically. We talk about China's economic policy, Belt and Road Initiative, China coming in, not only like economy in the sense of broader economy, but they also come militarily, having in mind their contracts with Serbia and selling weaponry. The question is, how much do they bring with themselves the political model, their political model, and how much does that influence the region, including authoritarian regimes and a lack of respect, more or less, for the laborers and people who work, salaries, treatment, and closing an eye to corruption and other issues related to it. So how do you see that part of their coming into the region and Europe, actually?
Thank you. Let me add to what my dear friend Angelos have correctly mentioned. China enters the region as a lending and investing power, but investments are rare. If we discuss foreign direct investment, there are only two. Piraeus port in Greece and metallurgy in Serbia. All the rest are loans. So if there is a total investment sum of about 33 billion euros, only 2.5 are FDI. So this is very important. So what Angelos has just mentioned about the debt trap is very real in the region. Also, the contracts are conducted by Serbian firms, by Chinese firms using Chinese banks, and also importing Chinese workers. And what's even more, I think, important to note, that in some cases we have even at the security level, Chinese policemen, for example, in Belgrade, there is joint patrols of Serbian policemen together with Chinese policemen. Unfortunately, it's not only the case there. We've seen the same phenomenon in Albania and also in Italy, a member of the EU. What is the rationale behind that? What China says, for us, it's in order to deal with the rights of Chinese workers in these countries. But I think it's not something we should encourage, and it's something we should reflect on. So what China does is that it does not respect standards and procedures of the EU, mainly environmental standards. What it does in different investments in metallurgy and other sectors is totally against European standards. And it's because these countries are not members of the EU, so it's possible to do, and also GDPR. What Angelos mentioned about the surveillance system, it's the double project Smart Cities and Safe Cities. Only in Belgrade, there are more than 1,000 cameras all over the central parts of the city.
Which is also a security issue. Basically,
Absolutely.
it's a security issue.
And where there are no GDPR standards. So they take pictures of the face of people, of the plates in cars, and we don't know where they keep these data, what they do with them. So,
and how they can be misused.
Exactly. So this, and that's why I say it's the responsibility of the EU. As long as it takes more and more time to take in these countries, it's like a total El Dorado for China. It can do whatever it wants. And the project is through its economic might, which we all know it's very important, to control. For the moment, the Chinese rhetoric is that we are a friendly nation, we don't intervene in politics, we don't intervene in your license. But what we see, in fact, through its soft power and through the Confucius institutes all over the region, is that they try to influence and control slowly, but in a very important way, the mindset of, and let me give you a final example. During the pandemic, what the EU has done for the region was enormous. If you ask the people of the region, who helped them the most?
They would say China.
China number one, Russia number two, and only third the EU, which is totally false at the factual level.
If I may add, China always emphasizes non-interference in the political affairs of the states in the Western Balkans, and they also say that we promote a win-win cooperation. You are going to win if you cooperate with us, and we are going to win cooperating with you. That's the main idea.
Mindset, it's a mindset. Valbona, from the security point of view.
I agree with my colleagues on everything that was mentioned here. I think it's important, we know that the Balkans is important for China for its strategic position, but we should see that Chinese engagement and influence in the region in the framework both of Belt and Road, but also Chinese foothold in Europe. And that's why, the European Union needs to pay more attention, is paying more attention, because one of the reasons is that the huge infrastructure gap that exists between Western European countries and the Western Balkans, and the lack of financing from Western international institutions. That's why we see this amount of money coming from China. So I believe that the mantra of no strings attached I believe that we should be very clear-eyed that this is ropes attached for the future of the Western Balkans, because it impacts in every way the EU enlargement process, going from fundamentals to procurement rules to economic standards to democracy and corruption. So I think while the Chinese government is very openly about the EU enlargement of the region, because having foothold in the Western Balkans means being tomorrow inside the European Union, I believe it's important to look at what could be some of the disadvantages and criticism regarding that.
And I would like actually to close with the last question with you, Mr. Daalder. We've been discussing so much for 40 minutes almost now about Russia's influence, China's influence, about how to keep the Western Balkans really Western, which means keep it on the right track towards the EU. According to your opinion, which are like the most imminent dangers for the countries in the Western Balkans, be it political, geostrategic, security, even economical, coming from China or anybody else? So if you would mention a couple of them.
Yeah, I think, let me take a slightly bigger picture. China, more so than Russia, but Russia too, is engaged in the geostrategic competition using the Western Balkans as its means, and they're just better at it than we are. That's the reality. We are losing this geostrategic competition in the Western Balkans, and you just heard why. Whether it's in Huawei systems and the infrastructure and everything else, the ability to convince a population that China and Russia are more important to their health and security than the European Union, that's a problem. That's a huge problem for the European Union.
So the narrative is in their favor? The narrative is in their favor?
The narrative is in their favor, and they're gaining influence, and they're gaining influence ultimately in a region that is of vital economic security and geographic and political security of Europe. So I agree with the fact that Europe has not done enough. This is not, frankly, something that the United States should bear responsibility for. This is about Europe, and it's about the European Union. And the European Union needs to decide whether they're going to win this game by playing it smarter or lose. And part of it is going back to this idea of the stabilitocracy, as you mentioned, a long-term view that is basically decided for a whole host of domestic reasons within EU countries that we're going to switch the enlargement process from bringing people in and then working with them to become more democratic and more open, to insisting that they meet every standard of a Western democracy before they enter. That's the shift that happened. It's a shift that was mandated by domestic politics in EU countries, particularly in Western Europe, and it's a shift that now we might want to revisit.
Yeah, got it. Thank you very much, Mr. Daalder, Mr. Syrigos, Ms. Koppa, Ms. Zeneli. Thank you very much for all your opinions. I hope we have been enough interesting for the audience today. Thank you, and hope to see you next time.